Welcome to Top Down with TCM, where we take a big picture look at how today's world is shaped by the events of the past and the possibilities of the future. I am your host, Mateo Garcia, and today's episode is called The Birth of Capitalism. Get comfortable, because for the next 10 minutes, we are going to explore how a groundbreaking institution called the East India Company changed the face of trade, helped spark modern capitalism, and inspire the ambitious companies we see around us today. So let's take ourselves back in time to the early 17th century. England was on the brink of becoming a significant global power. But at that moment, it was by no means guaranteed that it would grow to rule the seas or transform it to the empire it later became. Now, enter a group of London merchants. They were not satisfied with the status quo. Sure, trading locally or within small European circles was good, but they wanted more. They had heard stories of spices, silk, jewels, and all sort of exotic goods that came from the East. Places like India, Indonesia, and beyond. They recognized there was a fortune waiting to be made. But the greatest risk was the journey itself. Because you couldn't just hop on a plane those days. We're talking about long, arduous voyages by ship, with dangers ranging from pirate attacks, to storms, to diseases that no one really knew how to cure. So these merchants got together in the year 1600 and secured a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, effectively granting them a monopoly on English trade with the East. That was how the East India Company was born. Now, in modern terms, we might view it as a sort of a startup. But it was far from a scrappy little business. It was one of the first joint stock companies in history, which meant they could raise money by selling shares, spreading the risk among multiple investors, and also securing funding for the expensive voyages, building ships, and set up trading posts without any single investor having to shoulder the entire financial burden. Think about how we talk about IPOs today. It is not entirely different from what we see these people doing. They were basically telling potential investors, come put some money into this risky but potentially huge endeavor, and if we strike it rich in the East, everyone gets a slice. It is also worth mentioning that the East India Company had a unique approach to governance. Over time, they were not just trading cotton, silk, and tea. They became so powerful that they started to act almost like a state within a state, maintaining their own military and administrative structures. They negotiated treaties, minted their own currency in certain areas, and even waged wars. The kind of corporate power they exercised was unprecedented in world history. So when we talk about the birth of capitalism, we cannot ignore how the East India Company embodied a new concept of enterprise. The idea that profit-driven, privately funded, global ventures could shape the fate of nations. Their voyages were staggering in scope. They sailed to India, Malaysia, and the Spice Islands, places that dazzled the European imagination with resources that were scarce back home. They introduced new tastes to English society and later to the rest of Europe, such as tea, which became a feature of British culture. Over time, the company gained more and more influence, eventually establishing control over huge parts of India. At its height, the East India Company controlled a massive chunk of global trade. Some accounts say it was responsible for around half of the world's commerce in goods like cotton, silk, tea, and spices. Not bad for a corporation started by a few merchants looking for a new way to make money. But like all great powers, the company's reign didn't last forever. Eventually, their heavy-handed rule sparked resistance, and corruption within the company itself became a massive problem. Local populations began to resent the intrusion of foreign merchants, telling them how to run their affairs. One of the most famous turning points was the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny, where local soldiers under East India Company rose up against the British overlords. It was a bloody conflict that exposed the company's vulnerability and, in the end, forced the British Crown to take direct control over India, effectively dissolving the company's political power. By 1874, the East India Company was dismantled, leaving behind a profound legacy. On the one hand, it created enormous wealth for its investors and introduced new products to Europe. On the other hand, it had also exploited local populations and disrupted local economies, setting in motion a legacy of colonial rule that would shape global politics for centuries. Now, here's the thing. We're still living in the shadow of what the East India Company pioneered. Joint stock corporations that can operate on a global scale, seeking new frontiers and tackling enormous risk for potentially enormous rewards. If that sounds familiar, just think of today's big tech companies, or even more dramatically, think of SpaceX, Elon Musk's audacious ventures aiming to push humanity into space colonization. When you see a space rockets launching, you're looking at a company that's raising capital from private and sometimes public sources, taking huge risks to push a boundary most of us never imagined was possible. Musk's vision is to make humanity multi-planetary, similarly to how the East India Company sought to connect continents for trade. The difference, of course, is that we're talking about outer space instead of the high seas, and hopefully there is less exploitation involved in exploring Mars and beyond. Yet, on the conceptual level, the parallels are intriguing. A relatively small group of visionaries or investors pulling enormous resources and taking on big risk, because the potential payoff, whether that is in goods, knowledge, or prestige, is massive. SpaceX alone isn't the entire story. Today, major companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, and others behave in ways reminiscent of the East India Company, albeit in a more regulated global framework. They build vast infrastructures, influence supply chains around the planet, and hold significant power over local economies. Just think of how Amazon's reach has impacted retail, logistics, and even cloud computing. The logic is the same. Gather resources, spend aggressively, establish new markets, and try to ensure that the profits flow back to the shareholders and investors. The East India Company would probably recognize the model quite well. Capitalism as a system thrives on constant growth and expansion, and it can bring both benefits like technological progress and economic development, and drawbacks such as the inequality and the risk of overreach. These conversations were triggered in large part by the early successes and failures of the East India Company. So when we talk about the birth of capitalism, we are talking about a set of ideas and structures that effectively began to take shape over 4 centuries ago. Of course, you could argue that the capitalism has existed in various forms for much longer, pointing to medieval merchant families or trade routes in the ancient world. But the East India Company represents a watershed moment. It introduced a modern concept of a multinational corporation with enormous power to shape global events, changing how goods were bought and sold and how entire nations interacted. In many ways, we are all living in a world created by the company's example. The freedoms and complexity of capitalist markets, the wide availability of goods from all over the planet, the potential for private enterprises to solve big problems. These had roots in that era that gave rise to the East India Company. But so do the concerns about monopoly exploitation, and unchecked corporate power. Just as the company once stood astride the seas, controlling supply lines and negotiating political treaties, we see modern governments around. We see modern corporations negotiating with governments around tax policies, regulations, and labor conditions. The story is different but oddly familiar. So next time you brew a cup of tea, reflect on the fact that this ordinary beverage was once a luxury product controlled by a colossal corporation that helped shape modern capitalism. And the next time you watch a SpaceX rocket lifting off, think about how centuries ago another bold group of investors sailed into the unknown. Thank you so much.